thank you for joining us, Charles. And you've got a new book coming out, Architecture Design, which is, the title is Radical Postmodernism. So what is this radical impulse?
It's an attempt, I think, by us, in conjunction with Charles Jenks, we've edited it with him, to try and describe what interests us about postmodernism and to sort of track back to what we think are sort of potential legacies of a kind of more radical side of it. And I suppose the thesis is that everything you think you know about postmodernism, all the reasons you'd hate it, it's not that. I think for us, our interest in postmodernism is probably twofold, and the more flippant interest was in just looking at something which seemed to be verboten, just kind of like, you know, something that everyone wanted to forget about architecture, that it was a kind of an engagement or a capitulation to kind of commerciality and the market and big business and stuff, and everyone kind of wanted to put that behind them. So we were partly interested in that simply because it seemed to have some shock of, you know, the very recently fashionable, the worst thing that you could possibly be looking at. But I think possibly less superficially than that, we were interested in looking back at what seemed to us quite a series of legitimate interests that postmodernism raised. Probably really through Venturi Scott Brown, Charles Moore, and a few others, really looking at the kind of everyday in architecture, looking at the sort of popular cultural landscape, trying to get architecture really, in the words of Learning from Las Vegas, to learn from what was going on in culture at that time. And that seemed to us actually to be a kind of updating of modernism's impulses, which was to look outside of architectural discourse, formally and conceptually, at what was happening. And of course, you know, in the early modernist period, that was mostly the kind of industrialization process, industrial architecture and machine architecture, to look at planes and boats and grain silos. And it seemed to us that postmodernism was actually initially a very useful updating of that, which is to look at mass media, popular culture, etc. And that seemed to us quite a kind of radical potential for architecture, which partly because the movement became completely kind of confused with sort of 80s excess and right-wing politics, Reaganism and Thatcherism, and partly because architects are very aesthetic individuals who probably don't like a lot of kind of everyday popular culture imagery, it got suppressed. And so I think the answer is really that we think there's a lot of interesting things which people just refuse to kind of look at, and we wanted to unearth some of those. But I think there's an impulse to be more directly interested in communication, certainly, and I think, you know, what came after it, particularly deconstruction, will obviously be looking at far more kind of arcane modes of communication. So the directness of postmodernism appealed, and then swiftly, I think, for a lot of people became, for want of a better term, slightly cheesy. But I also think it wasn't purely about that as well. You know, some of the work that interests us most from the 60s and 70s period is actually quite complex and difficult work in a lot of ways. I mean, one thinks of the Venturi Scott Brown houses, which are, you know, quite tense, quite difficult, and actually very modernist objects, which have been inflected through some other interests. So it wasn't purely the kind of communicative pop stuff. Something of the kind of complexity is interesting too.
Okay, so not so literal, I guess the transformation of the ordinary back into the architectural project.
Yeah, less the kind of, you know, the giant dolphins of the Dolphin Hotel by Michael Graves, and perhaps more the sort of very tense relationship with the everyday of something like, you know, Venturi Scott Brown Fire Station.
And I guess the Australian strain of radical postmodernism, you've been in Adelaide and Melbourne the last few days. What's your verdict on the Australian strain? Did you have much idea before you came, and do you have less understanding now that you're here?
Yeah, a little bit more maybe, actually, hopefully. ARM are in the book, and we've been aware of their work for quite a while. We were in a joint exhibition with them and some other people in New York a few years back called Sign and Surface, and we were obviously in the sign camp with them.
They're in the sign camp as well.
So there was people who were looking at scenography, sign-based surface architecture, in terms of, you know, the flattened image, and then people much more to do with the kind of folding and other sort of contemporary architectural tropes. So we were aware of them then, and they're in the book. And their kind of total sort of ballsy version appeals because I think as much as we're interested in what I describe as maybe slightly more difficult strains of postmodernism, there is a kind of sort of slightly gleeful sort of embracing of the vulgar, which if I might be so bold, their work kind of doesn't shy away from, which is great. And seeing their work though, I think it's also a lot of other things going on, and it's not really. It doesn't seem that involved in sort of pure architectural iconography. I'm talking to members of the practice. Their work's referring to lots of other kind of things. They talk a lot about referring to things which are way outside architecture.
But I mean, when you were at their buildings yesterday and talking to ARM about them, did you understand the reference?
Yes, I did actually. Yeah, and they make it kind of clear what's going on in some senses, and their work's quite wide-ranging. There's some of it which you can see as purely kind of within the decorated shed idiom, like the building in Adelaide, extruded lettering. But there's other stuff which is veering towards a kind of deconstructivist kind of end, and a more sort of sci-fi modern. So I think their work's pretty sort of sprawling in what it's up to.
And you mentioned the duck and shed before, but you also mentioned a term in Adelaide the other day, the turducken. Can you explain what that is? Because I'm still confused.
Yeah, well, that's actually kind of slightly appropriated from my colleague Sam, who was, I think, used it originally trying to talk about Paul Rudolph, and of course the kind of classic 60s, or early 70s debate, the duck and the decorated shed, and antagonism between the Venturis and Rudolph and Brutalist school. And I suppose it was a slightly tongue-in-cheek way to talk about the idea that there might be these things aren't entirely polar opposites. So the duck is obviously meant to be kind of it only has a sort of quality on the outside, and whatever's left is left. But the idea that you could do things which were iconographic on the exterior, which might also have a kind of complex interior. Turducken's a slightly ludicrous way to describe that.
Yeah, but I mean, when you have the inside and the outside, and the relationship is not so clear between the two. Sometimes you would say, and in particular, you did a project for Urban Splash, which are known in Melbourne because they came last year to speak at the conference, I think, at the AIA, and you have this. There's this tendency of gentrification. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just gentrification of an area and of a building, and when you take up ordinary objects of the client and then you return them to the house in a strange or unfamiliar way. How did the client receive this?
Well, depends who you mean by the client on that one.
I don't mean the council, but the actual individuals who had to be owners, residences.
I think because it was a process where we did consultation with them, and it was a genuine, fairly organic process. I think. We'd never designed a group of houses before, so I think we went into.
And have you since?
Yeah, we have. Various schemes which haven't quite come to light yet, or in the process of coming to light. So it was our first go at that, and I think the circumstances of that project were very particular, and the design process was very particular.
Okay.
So I think they were, the kind of bland answer is very happy with those houses, but the more complicated answer is a
deeper happiness as well, not just the fun of.
Well, I think those houses are very highly sort of practical. I think they work very well, and they work very well in response to very particular things. And we were, very much trying to find a sort of typological solution, and we came up with this L-shaped unit, which is open plan but can be compartmentalised. You can make it into a much more traditional layout, and certain other sort of slight tweaks to a traditional house plan, which I think are very relevant. It's a very relevant contemporary typology. I think there was also a sense. I remember when we got to the end of the process, and we had an interesting conversation with them about the use of super graphics on the exterior, because the industrial lofts in the area are predominantly red brick, and they often have the name of the actual factory painted on the side. Sometimes, when they're a bit posher, they have it in kind of white tiles on the outside. And we sort of explored the idea that we might have some of that painted on the outside. And they were kind of horrified by this, because the planners went, "Oh, that's lovely, you can refer to the history of the site by having the names of the factories." And the residents were like, my great-grandfather lost his arm in a factory. I can't think of a more inappropriate form of architectural decoration than that. And of course we went, yes, that's absolutely right. But also as part of that conversation, they were saying, how much that the houses are to change from what their conception of what they might be prepared to like in a way from what they started at. And really looking back at the process, going, actually can't quite explain why they look like this, but it's fine. But they look pretty weird in comparison to what.
Okay. And so they like this abstractedness.
I think there were certain kind of critical moments in the design process where things like the kind of big facade came about because we went, okay, we've got these little houses, we've got these big apartments, and we could have this facade that can do whatever you want on it. It can be each individual house. And that seemed to be a good way to deal with it, which everyone could kind of understand as a sort of tactic, which obviously appealed to us as architects because there's an interesting kind of thing going on. And we were always interested in this issue of personal taste, as you allude to, the kind of representation of certain sort of values inherent in that community that might not ordinarily get expression in the act of regeneration, or quite the opposite, be kind of erased, really. And then certain sort of, traditional design issues, like how do you deal with, differences in scale, how do you deal with public and private, how do you make a street work, things like that. So the facade, which is the most kind of noticeable feature of it, became a way to deal with all of those things, and at the same time as deal with them, kind of articulate them, make them not necessarily resolved. You can still see that there's a kind of issue going on.
Yeah. Okay. I've just got one more question, I guess, which is your anti-manifesto, do the wrong thing. I mean, you make statements like ignore the brief, alienate the client, don't enter competitions. How dogmatic are you with these points?
They're not at all, really. They arise out of a kind of our extreme lack of nous, I think, over the years. We are possibly our redeeming factor, but the thing that's made things quite difficult, of course, is that we've done things because we've been interested in them. And we started off a practice, the name FAT, in order to avoid a kind of personal ownership of it, which is a kind of, in itself fairly sort of uncommercial thing to do. We tried to do work which foregrounded kind of ideas and concepts rather than individual signature and stuff. And so right from the beginning, we were kind of slightly counterintuitive about setting up an architecture practice, probably because we weren't trying to set one up. And so I think, a lot of the stuff that we've done, if you looked at it from a point of view of like, how do you become a successful architecture practice, you wouldn't do any of it. And I think also probably there's a slight, bloody-mindedness to our work.
It's kind of like a strategy in a way to break the rules to make more room for yourself in a way, or to develop your own intuition.
Yes, and to explore areas of architecture which are kind of relatively untrammeled. It seems to us that there's a lot of ground which everyone's kind of occupying. And so, the interest in postmodernism, again, going back to that, is a way of trying to find something which not everyone's looking at. And in that, there might be something that's interesting and kind of relevant, which everyone's kind of missing. So, there's a serious intent in all of those things, which is to kind of work slightly against the grain, but expand the possibilities of architecture, either stylistically or through language, by looking at languages outside of minimalism or modernism, but also more fundamental in terms of architectural practice, to work in ways that architecture don't always work. So whether that's through public engagement and consultation, or doing art projects, or being our own client, or commissioning someone else, and being a client for someone else. All of these things which we've done are all kind of ways to sort of map out some different terrain for architects.